The Western mind has for centuries boggled at Russia. They sit in an uncanny valley where they have several very European traits, but others which are very Asiatic. Russia has been one of the most powerful countries in all of world history. The world's view is still focused on Russia today due to their war with Ukraine. That being said, Russia has always kept to itself. Like a quiet, really jacked kid who eats by himself at the edge of the cafeteria table, Russia just keeps doing its own thing, while the rest of the world watches in confusion. This video exists to explain the Russian mind and Russian civilization, what assumptions you need to change between the West and Russia in order to understand how Russia works as a culture. What I've found with these videos is that if you understand the conditions under which a certain culture forms, you are capable of empathizing with them, even if you don't like the endpoint. Of any country in the world, Russia is possibly the one Americans or Westerners should try their hardest to understand, as it's been our rival for centuries. In this video, we will tackle one of the greatest and most impressive countries in history. While reading up on Russia, I found it would have been really useful to actually know Russian. Even when you have English translations for books, things get lost when you don't understand the ideas expressed in the language of origin. That's why I use Babbel. They make learning a new language become very simple and engaging. Babbel teaches real-world practical conversations for things like travel, business, and ordering food. The lessons are 10 minutes, making them short and easy to follow, using award-winning technology scientifically proven to get you speaking in just 3 weeks. The lessons are designed by real language teachers with a grounded understanding of how to help students learn, and they provide a variety of ways to learn, from podcasts to games to videos and live classes with top teachers. Babbel offers a lot for anyone looking to learn, and if for any reason you're not satisfied, Babbel also comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. Whether you're looking to move, open a business, or just travel the world, Babbel is a useful tool to help you start learning a new language, or for any of my fans who use the link below. Babbel is offering 60% off your subscription, so go sign up today. Part 1. Geography. Russia is very clearly part of Orthodox civilization, and I've already made a video on Orthodox civilization. That being said, in the same way, America is very much part of Western civilization, and I made a video on American civilization. I'm going to give Russia the same treatment. I think Russia deserves analysis as its own society in this format. Furthermore, a majority of my video on Orthodox civilization was on the Byzantine Empire, where that civilization formed, while Russia was added on as a later extension. If you want more context on what unifies the Orthodox world together, watch that video. However you divide the Orthodox world on a civilizational basis is really a Rorschach test for how you see the world or what metrics you use. This is since you have the big four civilizations, as I call them, those being Europe, the Middle East, India, and China. Well beyond that, the lines get more blurry or arbitrary. Some thinkers have put Byzantium as an extension of Greco-Roman civilization. Others, like Spengler, put it as part of the Middle East. Some say that Byzantium is its own independent civilization while Russia is something new. Some people don't find these distinctions useful since all European societies are similar enough that the lines don't matter. The Polish writer Konecki said that Russia is an extension of Mongolian Central Asian civilization. I'm not going to get too bogged down in this discourse. I think arguing that these divisions can devolve into intellectual masturbation pretty quickly. I'd like to talk about Russia as it exists as a society, not how it fits into these theories. That being said, I think all of these theories have at least some element of validity to them, in that Russia, literally being in the center of the map, has taken elements from many different societies, so much so that it's formed its own organic mixture, which has elements from many into a new whole. When you look at a nation, beyond all the waves of history and culture sits the geography. No matter the society, it must match and conform to the geographic necessities which are given to it. Russia combines some of the worst and best geography in the world at the same time. The fate of the Russian nation depends upon mitigating the negative aspects of its geography while playing up its positive. People like Peter Zeihan or Real Life Lore or Jared Diamond with Guns, Germs, and Steel like to say that geography is destiny, which I think has an element of truth but isn't the whole truth. Look at America, which all of these thinkers like to say is geographically blessed. And I think that's true to a certain degree, but they ignore how the American South was malarial, the Great Plains unfarmable, and the desert too dry to live in. The inland water systems in America don't connect to each other without canals. What this ignores is that the Americans were competent enough as a society to be able to mitigate the negatives of their geography. A country like Kyrgyzstan, for example, is very similar climactically and geographically to Wyoming, but they're very different societies. France probably has the best geography in Europe, but underperforms due to political choices in their society. Western Russia straddles the eastern bottleneck of the European peninsula. Russia geographically sits very far north. Even with southern Russia being at the latitude of France or Germany, which is northern Europe, well, St. Petersburg is at Stockholm or Oslo, and Moscow is to the latitude of Denmark. All of these regions, except southernmost Russia, are at the latitude of Canada. The reason Europe is so temperate at very northern latitudes, with England being at the same latitude as the Canadian Arctic and Labrador or Siberia, is because of the Gulf Stream. However, Russia has a very continental climate with freezing winters and boiling summers. This has ironically been one of Russia's great protectors, or the brutality of its climate, as I'm sure many of you know about from Russian history. Western Russia sits between three different climactic or bioregions, with the Arctic taiga in the north, which is uninhabitable for a developed society. South of that is the temperate forests, which is the climate of most of the European peninsula, where the ethnic Russians developed. South of that is the steppe, much like the American Great Plains. This region was inhabited by nomadic tribes like the Mongols, Pechenegs, Tatars, or Scythians. The further you get into Asia, the temperate forest zone shrinks, with almost all of Siberia being either taiga or steppe. The Slavs, now the largest ethno-linguistic group in Europe, started out in the worst position of any group in Europe. This is partly since trade was so much cheaper by water in the pre-industrial world, while the Slavs were as far as you could possibly be from the sea in Europe, starting in northern Ukraine and Belarus. This meant that even at the time of the Roman Empire, the Slavs were incredibly primitive, as the Romans just had no reason to interact with them. The Slavs also sat at the edge of the Eurasian Step, or a highway from which the most savage warriors in world history came from, with the Mongols or Huns being easy examples. Effectively, the early Slavs lived right next to a giant tiger natural park. Their entire society had evolved to fight off these tigers. These steppe peoples were also absolutely brutal and had no concept of humanity. If you want to look at pre-industrial atrocities or wars, these steppe tribes provide the vast majority of the bloodiest events. The Mongols, just one steppe people, killed 100 million people in a time when the whole world's population was something like 500 million. I have a cultural region I've talked about in a bunch of previous videos, which is the former Mongol Empire. You can craft this onto a bunch of different things, whether the current anti-American alliance between the Russians and Chinese, or the communist bloc in the Cold War. Alternately, the exogamous clan family structure, or with authoritarianism today. The reason the former Mongol bloc exists is that these are societies which are in proximity to the Eurasian Steppe. A great irony which proves the point is that Mongolia, the eye of the storm which produced these conquests, almost never fits the patterns that the rest of the former Mongol Empire has, with Mongolia being democratic, pro-American, relatively free, with having high social status for women. The thing is that in decisive situations like company leadership or war, authoritarianism is the best social model. This is since there needs to be a single leader who can make quick decisions and coordinate the entire front at once. Committees weaken the vigor of leadership. You can correlate authoritarianism very closely with how threatened a society is by war. This is why democracy started to flourish in the modern world with the Anglosphere and the Netherlands, countries very far away from the center of the map. These societies also tend to view the individual human life with contempt, since they needed to feed vast amounts of men into the meat grinder to fight off the nomads, who would kill millions for no reason. In the brutal wars against the nomads, human life didn't matter so much, so these societies got used to that. The early Slavs started out as effectively minions of the nomadic tribes. They were vassals of the Scythians, who were the ethnically European original inhabitants of Central Asia and the Western Steppe. For the first few centuries of the Christian era, the southern steppe was settled by Germanic tribes, namely the Goths. When the Huns, a tribe coming out of Mongolia, smashed onto the western steppe, it drove the Goths into the Roman Empire, which precipitated the Germanic migrations, which made the Roman Empire fall. However, it also drove the Germans out of Eastern Europe, which was populated by the Slavs. The Slavs were allies of the Huns, Avars, and other nomadic peoples, since there weren't enough nomads to populate the region, and the Slavs ended up populating a giant area stretching from eastern Germany to Greece and Russia to Bohemia. The Slavs were the least advanced large population Europe, and ended up getting folded into pre-established civilizations rather than forming their own. The Slavs were divided between Western and Byzantine civilization. Also, the Slavs are ethnically and linguistically, even today, really close. For example, the linguistic or genetic differences between Poles and Russians aren't that large, but as they took in different civilizations, over time the cultural differences became massive. The modern Russian nation formed as Swedish Vikings populated the river system between the Baltic and the Black Sea in order to trade with the Muslims or Byzantines. They colonized the native Slavic population. They started a large slave and resource trade, where the term Slav is related to the word slave for a reason. This has started a history of Russia ever since, being an attempt at colonization by the West, reaching towards the riches of the East. Over time, the Vikings assimilated into the local Slavic population so that Russia became a Slavic nation. I reach issues with the geographic determinist argument here, since you can see some very clear turning points where Russia could have ended up as a very different society than our timeline. One is that Russia in 1000 AD converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, but there was a significant Western, Islamic, steppe, and even Jewish influence in the Rus at that time. The Turkic Khazar kingdom at that time were Jews. I think there are timelines where Russia could have converted to any one of those religions. The medieval Russian states in the 12th century were in a lot of ways indistinguishable from Western Europe. Some had parliaments, there were property rights, and unlike Western Europe, which was dominated by serfdom at that time, Russian peasants were actually free. The average Russian had a better standard of living than a West European at that point, and visitors from Western Europe wrote positively of the vigor, optimism, and energy they saw in Russia. Russia sits in the middle of the map, so it's constantly being pulled in many directions at once, and it can take good or bad things from any of those directions. Also, what I think the geographic determinist argument ignores is that Russia has many geographic positives, which it hasn't played into. One being that, as you can see with the Vikings, Russia is unified by a bunch of interconnected river systems. This is something which it shares with the United States. Also, during the Viking and early medieval period, Russia was very glued into international trade, with the cities of Russia being very wealthy and being the nexus of a trade which stretched out to Central Asia, India, China, Western Europe, and Islam. Russia didn't end up following this path, but there was a very clear potential that it could have, because it did for several centuries. Secondly, Russia in many ways is a geography comparable to a large part of the United States or Canada. My family's from Nebraska, a climate nearly identical to the area around Stalingrad. However, if you compare the culture of those two areas, they are incredibly different. Most of America doesn't have an interconnected river system, and a lot of America is cold grassland like Russia. America and Russia both have some of the most fertile soil in the world. That being said, if you compare the productivity between American and Russian farmers, America is vastly higher. Russia is blessed, like Brazil, with one of the highest per capita shares of resources in agriculture per person, but Russia is still not a rich country. Russia is also an example of how genetics don't perfectly drive history. Although we've proven that genetics does impact history and the world to a certain degree, there are mitigating examples like this. Russians are genetically not that different from West Europeans. Europe's genetic gradient is mostly south, not east-west. The genetic difference between Russians and Americans aren't massive, but it's harder to imagine more different societies culturally. Russia sits between the East and West in a few different ways, which is something authors have been saying for Russia's entire history. It's similar to Europe genetically and through its Christianity. Meanwhile, it's Asian in its collectivism. Russians have lived in clans until very recently, unlike Europe, but very much like Asia. I've made this video on how family structure informs society, where the collectivism of the Russian family structure and the authoritarian power it gives to fathers is very similar to China, thus creating a similar political structure to China. I've spoken about in previous videos how you can use a family structure to predict a society's political, cultural, and religious structure, since the family imprints what intuitively seems fair to the people in that society. An important detail to throw in here is that the Russian peasants have never had property rights. Until 100 years ago, Russian villages held all their lands in common and would give out land to those who needed it. This led in two directions. Firstly, you can see why communism would intuitively make sense to this kind of people. Secondly, with no property rights, there was no incentive to work hard since you wouldn't keep any of it. It kept the average Russian desperately poor, while the upper classes, who could own property, have been very innovative and hardworking. If you look at Russian history, you see a small upper class which has achieved incredible results, while the majority population is largely in stasis. This is also driven by, and itself feeds into, the immense classism and inequality over Russian history. A reason the Russians have often been so advanced intellectually or artistically, but not economically or technologically, is that since Russia is so far removed from naval trade routes, but ideas can move really quickly by foot, but not stuff like industrial equipment. For a brief note before we continue, you guys should check out the second podcast I have on my other channel, History 102, where we cover different historic time periods with Eric Torenberg, where I take an hour to, for example, explain the fall of Rome, the Vikings, the American Civil War, World War I, and other historic periods, and our goal is to cover all of history. So if you want to learn history, check out History 102, or alternately, YouTube is a very chaotic place, and we live in an age of cancellation, so also please donate to my cancellation insurance. Now back to the video. Part 2, the Tatar Yoke. The definitive founding moment of modern Russia is the conquest by the Mongols, or as the Russians and Europeans of that era called them, Tatars. If you want to look at the moment and impetus which created the Russian society of today, it's here. The Kievan Rus society, which formed under the Vikings, is to the modern Russians what the Romans are to the Western Europeans. You can definitely see continuity between, let's say, the Romans or Italians, but there is a difference. What happened is that the modern Belarusians and Ukrainians spent much more time being colonized by Poland, Lithuania, and the Russians by the Mongols. Thus, they evolved into different societies over time, although they were originally the same people. An inspiration for me to write this video in the first place was Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin, in which Putin spent a lot of the time going through Russian history. The point Putin was trying to make for why the war was justified is that the Ukrainians and Russians are the same people who belong together in unity. It stems from this idea that they were part of the Kievan Rus together and falsely severed due to centuries of foreign colonization. What are my ideas on this? I don't think it really matters. There is no justice in this world, and the borders of a country belong to whoever can conquer it. I understand this is brutal, but it's the only principle which has worked across history. The best way to see the Ukrainians and Russians is as if the South won the Civil War and established a separate independent country. Whether or not the South was an independent ethnicity from the North would be arguable. I think most of identity is self-determined, thus if Ukrainians believe themselves to be a different nationality, they probably are. The Mongols are one of the most brutal conquerors ever in history, and Russia was the region in their large empire which was treated the worst. The modern Russian state was modeled off the Mongols. This is why certain authors like Koneshki consider Russia to be a fundamentally Central Asian civilization. Moscow was unimportant before the Mongol conquest, but the reason it became the most important city in Russia was that it was chosen to be the tax collector for the other Russian states in the Mongol Empire. With this, Moscow was able to establish hegemony among the other Russian states under Mongol control. Russia is the most autocratic state in the entire pre-industrial world, barring the Inca as competitors. This came from the Mongols, in which the Mongol command all were expected to have unquestioning loyalty to the Khan. Russia Russia never developed any alternate institutions to the government at all. In Western Europe, you saw the establishment of independent churches, nobility, guilds, merchant classes, city-states, peasant groups, or even stuff as simple as bowling leagues, none of which developed in Russia. The Russian Tsar had the most power over his society of any ruler of his era. An important difference here is that all authority in Russia flowed from top to bottom. In Russia, all the nobility were appointed by the Tsar to a certain region that they were supposed to protect. In Europe, as a comparison, the nobility came from an area and over time became entrenched in that region to push its self-interest against that of the centralized government. The nobility in Russia were agents of the government and would literally call themselves slaves to the Tsar. They would pen letters to the Tsar, "Your humble slave." I think Russia is the continental-sized country in the world that has the least important regional differences. An interesting fact here is that a significant amount of the ancestry for the Russian nobility is in Tatar origin, more so than the peasants actually. This might be another factor pushing the classism in Russian history. Nomadic peoples tend to view the farmers as sheep, which, like domesticated animals, they can cull for their own purposes whenever they want. You see the elite having this attitude to the population across Russian history. Under the Tsars, they would conscript men for their entire lives, and to make it more humane, they decreased that to only 25 years. This will be even more obvious with serfdom later in this video. The Mongols had such ruinous tax rates that it provided no incentive to have commerce, and they would just periodically steal whatever they wanted. Thus, Russia degraded economically. Russia from this point on became a very poor country, as the Russian government afterwards kept similar policies. For all of Russian history since the Mongols, the ruling class were the friends of the central government. Russian society became about becoming friends with the central government, and then them letting you loot society for your own gain. The Russian government purposely tried to tamper down economic growth, with them keeping towns from growing beyond a certain length. Or also, they burned the prosperous merchant city of Novgorod. This is the biggest issue in Russia today, in that there is more Russian money outside Russia than inside it, since the wealthy try to predate upon the country and then get it outside to Cyprus, Panama, or London where it's safe ASAP. The Russian economy is dominated by these giant industries, which are run by oligarchs, while the economy doesn't allow competition. If you went back to Russia 500 years ago, it would look pretty similar. An interesting point the book Why Nations Fail has said is that if you look at the world 500 years ago, almost all the same countries would have the same socioeconomic structures, and the same countries would be rich or poor. It's similar in the church, where the Tsar had the right to remove any archbishops or priests who disagreed with his political agenda. An important point here is that in the West, the church acted as a humanizing influence upon society. The Western church banned debt slavery, slavery itself, liberated women, educated the populace, invented the concept of human rights or laws of war, or invented the scientific method. This never occurred in Russia, so Russian culture remained more brutal and inhumane. A point is that for Russian history, the church has been the real motivating force. If you were to ask normal Russians under the Tsars what their predominant identity was or why they fought in wars, they would say the church without hesitation. Russian society is profoundly Christian, although in a different way from the West. Religion was a great force which gave Russia the will to live through a hard society and so many brutal things in its history. One of the things Americans often forget is that modern Russia is a pretty recent country, or founded at roughly the same time as the United States. Russia declared independence and fought off the Mongols at the same time as Columbus discovered the New World. The Mongols held Russia as a colony for a century longer than anywhere else in their empire, like China or Persia. For a frame of reference, my home city of Philadelphia was built in the 1670s, while the area of modern Ukraine was settled by Russians in the 1780s, over a century later. The area around Vladivostok on the Pacific coast of Russia was conquered from the Chinese in the 1860s, or at the same time as the American Civil War. The Mongol tyranny was so brutal that it gave the Russians incredible motivation to avoid it. One of the traits which I admire most in the Russian character is their sheer grit. Too many times over its history, you'll hear about half of Russia's population died in the 1300s, and then another half died in the 1400s. Then Ivan the Terrible purged the ruling class in the 1500s, while Russia again lost a third of its population in the 1600s. Alternately, Russia provided half of the casualties in World War II, or 30 million people, after having already lost millions through Stalin's purges, the Russian Civil War, and World War I. People often talk of the Russian character being paranoid, but from my perspective, this paranoia is totally justified. Look at how many times their country gets invaded. If you read Russian history, it's remarkably impressive that their country is still here. This level of grit and courage stems from the Mongol conquest. The Mongols were so brutal that the Russians were willing to endure literally anything to avoid it again. When you look at the constraints the Russian people put themselves under, whether having no property rights, serfdom, or intense poverty, you see the force which propelled the Russian Empire was just sheer force of will. Russia is much like Rome, where you look backwards to see why their empire rose, and it's just incredible ambition or drive, or as Ibn Khaldun called it, asabiya. Peter Turchin has made a theory of history that a trans-ethnic, multi-century conflict creates the determination for an empire. I give examples of this in the text wall. Something to keep in mind is that for centuries after gaining independence, the Russians had to fight off the nomadic tribes. The Tatars enslaved hundreds of thousands of Russians into the 18th century, and the Russians even built their own version of the Great Wall of China on their southern frontier against the Tatars. Russia has ever since gaining independence seen itself as the most important country in history. Russia has called itself the Third Rome, or the successor to First Rome and later Byzantium. Russians have called themselves God's chosen nation, who existed to push Orthodox Christianity. I think there are a decent amount of parallels you can draw to America, which sees itself much in the same manner. The Russian character, I think due to all this pain, is capable of profound depths not seen in the West. Russian literature deals with how to face horrifying suffering. Almost like the great distances of the steppe, the Russian mind ventures far along a certain chain of logic, weaving themes together. This is why War and Peace is so long, philosophical, and hard to read. The Russians are the best people in the world at chess, which I can't draw a logical connection to, but I think it's there. Part 3. Frontier Cultures. In the years between 1550 and 1900, Russia went from a country of 5 million people to 100 million. America ironically did the same between 1750 and 1920. The best way to explain the Russian Empire is that there was just not enough pressure in the surrounding area, but the Russians had the drive to fill it. The Black Death hit Central Asia the hardest of almost anywhere in the world, which left the region depopulated, as well as Tamerlane's conquest, which killed 15 million people, and gunpowder nullified the nomads' military advantage. Writers for centuries wrote out the incredible fecundity of the Russians, how even though the average Russian lived in squalid poverty, they had so many children. Much like America, the Russians populated a massive region stretching from sea to shining sea, or the Black Sea to the Pacific. Russia is part of a giant flat area that has no natural borders, so the Russians expanded as far as they could. The only way Russia can be safe is by moving its flat borders as far away from the capital as possible. The reason I keep on comparing Russia to America is that they are simultaneously opposite and yet very similar societies, and that both are frontier nations on the edges of European civilization. They form useful parallels to the other in a lot of ways. An interesting mirror is that frontier societies tend to either lean towards freedom or slavery. This is since if you're in an underpopulated area, there isn't enough labor to do stuff. You can either solve this by not forcing people to do stuff and letting them be free, or enslaving them to do what you want. All frontiers manifest both of these traits in some way. In America, it was democracy, or the pioneer farmer, and African slavery. In Latin America, it was encomienda feudalism and the gaucho cowboys. In Russia, it was the Cossack and serfdom. The great difference is that freedom eventually won in America, while slavery did in Russia. Serfdom gradually was instated over the course of the 17th century. As said before, Russian peasants were free before this, and serfdom in Russia is fundamentally different than serfdom in medieval Western Europe in, let's say, 1200. Western European serfdom was basically you were a tenant farmer who just wasn't allowed to leave. You still had a lot of legal liberties, like your lord didn't literally own you, you just had to pay him rent and you couldn't get taken off your land or split up from your family. Meanwhile, serfdom in Russia is much more comparable to African slavery in America. Serf families could be broken up and serfs could be sold to different masters. Serfs had no legal rights and they could be killed by their masters with no justification. Masters often kept harem harems of serf girls. The astounding thing here is that the serfs were between 50 to 80% of Russia's population. Russia is one of very, very few countries where a majority of the population were slaves. If you'll ask me for anything which killed Russia, I'm going to say serfdom. The most important thing for an economy is an open labor market. Russian cities never developed as the serfs weren't allowed to leave the land. Russia never had capitalism for obvious reasons. The serfs had no incentive to work hard as it would all get stolen by the landlord. The reason I brought up geography in the beginning is a lot of Russia's failures are self-enforced, not determined. As a reaction to the rise of serfdom, the Cossacks were peasants who fled to the southern grasslands. The Cossacks are one of my favorite groups in history. They were basically horse pirates who organized in democracies. They were the ones who conquered the Russian Empire out into Siberia. Ironically, the Russian Empire, one of oppression, was spread by Cossacks trying to escape to freedom. Then the Russian government would follow and enserf the Cossacks in the late 18th century. The Cossacks had a few rebellions which nearly worked, but didn't. When I see Siberia, I see an underdeveloped area. If you've read a couple histories of Russia, it's kind of shocking how you can just ignore Siberia and still have a pretty comprehensible understanding of what's happened in Russian history. Only a quarter of Russians live in Siberia, but it's an area which comprises the vast geographic majority of Russia. An important fact is that the Chinese side of the border has 200 million people, while the Russian side had 5 million. These places have basically the same climate, but the Russian system provided no incentives to develop this land. It would be as if America west of the 100th parallel was just underpopulated. For a sort of mirror image to what Russia could have been, let's look to Poland-Lithuania. Russia and Poland are genetically and linguistically very close, but culturally and politically incredibly different. In the 1600s, when Russia was the most autocratic society in the world, Poland was most democratic. Poland in this time period was a parliamentary system where 12% of the population could vote. For some comparison, in Britain at the same time, only 3% of their population could. The Polish parliament even removed the king, and Poland had a constitution with tremendous liberties. Ironically, Poland had even worse serfdom than Russia, and Russian serfs, upon invading Poland, saw them as pathetic, which is insane. But Poland is an example of an Eastern European frontier creating political liberty. The Russians were able to crush the Poles since they were better organized, partly due to honestly being more autocratic. That being said, there was a period in the 1600s where it looked like Poland would become the dominant power. The Poles even conquered Moscow for a little, and the Russian nobility even supported the Polish king taking over Russia. If the Poles made a few different choices, Eastern Europe could have looked a lot like the United States. When the Russians conquered Poland in the 18th century, Poland was a significantly more advanced country where there were more literate Polish speakers in the Russian Empire than literate Russian speakers. The Tsar of Russia wanted to model Russia's constitution off Poland's, but then the French Revolution happened, which resulted in autocratic overreaction. This leads to a point where Russia from 1700 onwards realized it had to take technologies from the West in order to survive. Russia had one of its most capable rulers ever, being Peter the Great, who was narrowly able to defeat a Swedish invasion which nearly conquered Russia. Russia in the 300 years afterwards, with some autocratic xenophobic breaks, tried to westernize as a country. Russia was effectively a country trying to colonize itself. There was a westernized ruling class which spoke French, wrote the Russian great novels, and dominated the country, while there was a giant Slavic Oriental serf class who might as well have been in the Middle Ages. Russia is much like Persia, a giant autocratic empire with a long and proud history, but one that is incapable of becoming large enough to separate itself from the neighboring civilizations' trajectories. The Russians became entangled in Islam or the West in the same manner the Persians did with the Greeks or Muslims. You can't separate Russia's development from Western civilization, which you really can for Islam or China. Part 4. Serf Civilization. The rise of the Soviet Union was after serfdom was abolished and the Industrial Revolution finally brought the serf class to predominance, that they turned Russia into a great serf nation, one built in opposition to the Western ruling classes and their values. The Soviet Union illustrates a duality in the Russian character. All civilizations are driven by a duality of different traits, of which I have a text wall here to explain. In Russia, this is brutal realpolitik and idealism. Russia, in its character, combines an ability for exceptional exceptional cynicism and brutality, while at the same time, they can make some profound statements of the nature of God or see incredible beauty. Communism was a rebellion towards idealism, while the reality is it descended into cynical brutality. The rise of communism was caused by the end of serfdom, dissatisfying two different important demographics in the population. A great sad truth of the world is that reform is one of the worst things an autocratic state can do, with the best strategy being to keep its knife on the oppressed's throat. The end of serfdom didn't really help the peasants out much, partially since the way it was structured kept them in permanent debt, but also the Russian peasants hadn't evolved to be free, ever really. Secondly, Russia was becoming overpopulated, and as the population density increased, the resources per capita shrunk. Russia is one of the most traumatized societies ever, and communism is really a trauma reaction to that which was normal for most Russians, that being a communal existence without private property under a fanatical religion with an autocratic state. The Russian identity was predicated upon an idea of selflessness, which came from the communal village life. The second group were the sons of nobility, who after their fathers lost their serfs suddenly slid into poverty. They moved to the city and became overeducated, but there weren't enough jobs, and thus the only way they had to get into power was through communism. These two classes basically allied against the new merchant and kulak classes to reinstate serfdom in Russia. Russia going for communism was one of the worst decisions any society has ever done in human history. We all know that I love communism, which I have called a social cancer, predicated upon the wrong starting conditions about human nature. Watch my video on communism for more info. The short answer is that communism was used to devour the very little social capital Russia had developed compared to the government. Stalin killed the officer class, nobility, yeoman farmers, church, artists, scientists, philosophers, and more. Keep in mind the church was the thing which was the soul of Russian society. Thus, Russia effectively committed social suicide through communism. For a frame of reference, Russia in 1900 was an industrializing country with a rapidly growing population. It was an artistic and cultural powerhouse while also being the military terror of Europe and Asia. Skip to after communism, Russia was none of those things. A shell of a country with the most rapidly declining population of anywhere in the world. From computer models, we found that Russia was experiencing rapid growths in productivity before communism, which stopped under communism, where all the growth was arithmetic. Russia relapsed into its worst flaws right when it had the chance to do otherwise. In the 60 years between 1860 and World War I, Russia as a freer society experienced a lot of industrialization. Its artistic and cultural high point, and even had a weak parliament. For a few months, Russia was a parliamentary republic during World War I. I think this is one of those moments in history which hinged on leadership. The communists had one of the best leaders of the century, that being Lenin, and the whites had no such leader. As the name of my show suggests, what if? As I asked in this video, I made when I was still a child. My main theme for that video is that Russia very nearly became a very different country. I think even under some right-wing authoritarian governments, Russia could have done well. I see so much potential that was wasted in Russia. A sad thing about Russia is that it just gave up its empire willingly. The Soviet Union was so convinced communism was a failure that it let itself fall apart because it had no will to live. It's funny that Western communists continue to support communism even after its own founders in both China and Russia agreed it was a bad idea. Russia today seems like a hollow country. From what I've read and as I talk about in this video, Russia today is a society which has one of the weakest cultures in the world. They've purged everything in their culture that's organic or independent from the state. The good thing here is that voids like this are meant to be filled. The esoteric organizations like the Masons think the next great civilization will come from Eastern Europe over the next few centuries. I'd like the Russians to prove them right.